Hi there, and thank you for joining us on the Overcomers Overcoming podcast. We feature those who are in the process of overcoming or have overcome any type of life encounter, life obstacle that at the time seemed to be almost insurmountable. With this podcast, we have three objectives in mind. Our first objective is we want you to know with a confident resolve you are not alone. We want to work with you. We want you to know there are others who are working with you, who want to help you through whatever you are encountering, and together we will get through whatever you're experiencing.
Our second objective is there are multiple options for any life encounter you are facing. We want to help you develop a resolve that there are various options and solutions to any life dilemma.
Our third objective is to help you with critical thinking skills. If you're encountering something that was possibly a decision you made sometime in the past, and if you had the opportunity for a life redo, you would make a different decision. We want to help you with those critical thinking skills that can help you make an informed decision and not encounter what you're going through at the moment. We are the Cooper Culture, a veteran-owned business. We work with business personnel and families to develop and sustain connected relationship cultures within their families and organizations. That type organization is one where people feel wanted, appreciated, and genuinely a part of that organization. I'm with my wife and business partner, Marty, who is helping me facilitate this podcast. Today we feature Andrea Leeb, who discusses with us early parts of her life where her father, as she explains it, sexually abused her, and that formed a very early part of her life and what she thought of herself, which is not uncommon. It happens in some families where she needs to recover from and start a new beginning and achieve a new life. To her credit, she was able to overcome her past, and I will say quite honestly, your past does not define you. However, it may inspire you to live your future. So we applaud Andrea in having overcome her past and working toward helping others develop a better future. Marty, what are some takeaways we learned from Andrea?
Andrea, through the trauma, did not let that define her, as you have said, and she has been very successful with the determination and resilience.
And she has a book coming out where she profiles her life of the past, but more so the future. Let's listen and learn together. Andrea, it's great to have you with us. Our listeners are going to be very interested in knowing the aspect of resilience of your past, what you experienced as a 4-year-old child, because some of our listeners might be experiencing something like that or possibly have experienced something in the past. And we are believers that while your past may inspire your future, your past does not define your future, except as you allow it to do that. But our listeners are going to be very interested, Andrea, to whatever level you feel comfortable explaining your past, the trauma, but then more importantly, the focus is the future, how you overcame, how you're overcoming, because some people, I think, can allow their past to totally dominate their future to where they may feel they have no worth at all. But I think our listeners are going to gain great insight into your past life, but then your present and the future. Andrea, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Ron, and thank you, Marty. It's good to be with both of you this morning.
Andrea, can you explain to our listeners, to whatever level you want to, what the trauma was you experienced in the past, and then we will focus on how you overcame with resilience, your mindset, your decision, whatever, to overcome that past?
Sure. So I am, and I define myself as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. And in my case, the abuse was perpetrated by my father. I was 4.5 years old. My first memory of it, it was the first time I remember my father giving me a bath. And even that young, I knew there was something strange about the way that he was touching me. My mother, I was scared. I could hear his breathing. I knew he was touching me strangely. And when my mother came in to check on us, her reaction was she screamed. She crumpled to the. I write in my book that she screamed. It sounded like a howl, more like an animal than a human scream. And she crumpled to the floor. And when my father caught her, and when she woke, she was physically blind. And my mother stayed physically blind for a month. And I write that she stayed emotionally blind for decades. She experienced something called hysterical blindness. The abuse continued. I was almost 13 when it ended, so it went on for years and at varying periods of regularity. So that's the beginning of my story. I am a pretty resilient person, despite all of that, and I was lucky because I had a bit of an academic gift that I was able to use. And even though the abuse continued, my father told me it was my fault. So as a young child, I really believed that. I integrated that moment, that terror I felt, of seeing my mother fall, of seeing her blind. I really believed it was my fault. And he told me I couldn't tell anybody, and I integrated that too. So for years, I didn't tell anybody. I kept it to myself. And the abuse continued over that 10-year period. I am resilient, as I said. I'm lucky to be resilient. I was able to I used I had some good coping mechanisms and some bad ones. I disassociated a lot when the abuse was happening. I turned a lot of what my father of the abuse into myself as a young girl. Did a lot of self-harm. I stuck myself with pins. I cut myself, and those were ways that I could let out some of the pain. And I felt so much shame. But I still kept going, and I went to college. I became a nurse actually, and worked for the public health service for several years, and then ultimately went to law school and became a lawyer. And I convinced myself that, and this comes from a little bit from my mother, that if I was smart enough, pretty enough, perfect enough, that I could pretend and believe that none of these bad things ever happened. But as we know, secrets are really toxic. And for me, the secrets ate at me inside. I had little periods where I would break from that, from that perfection. When I was 22, I was, close to graduating from college, and I had a moment where I was luckily with two other people, and I wanted to throw myself off of Key Bridge. I literally took my shoes off and tried to climb, and luckily they stopped me. And I had a lot of moments like that where I wanted to kill myself, but then I would like rebound and have that time of resilience. So it was always there. Things might have looked pretty okay from the outside, but it was always there in the inside. Couldn't maintain intimate relationships with men. I went from man to man. At a certain point, I didn't care who I was with as long as they could keep the boogeyman out of my room. I, married several times, little tiny short marriages, and then I couldn't stay very long. So there were all these I looked okay from the outside, but if you looked really close, there were all these little symptoms. When I was 33, somebody grabbed my breast on a subway. A man grabbed my breast on the subway. The subway went dark for a minute. And this is way before 9/11, years before that. So when the subway went dark, people didn't panic the way that they would panic today. And in that darkness, I felt somebody grab my breast. And when the lights came on, I looked around and they all looked guilty to me. But that grope pushed me into a complete nervous breakdown. And I finally went and got professional help and told my secret to a therapist, and then went inpatient and told my secret to a group. I went into a program that was geared toward children, people who had experienced trauma as children, and it had a 12-step basis. So I finally told my secret to a group of other people, a support community. And I think that was what opened my journey to healing. So that's my I guess it's my Cliff Notes version of my story.
No, that's great. Thank you for being willing to share that. I want to see if I can process the chronology of this.
Mhm.
For 10 years or so, you were 13, 14 years old or so. It seems as about that point that you realized, no, this is not normal, not right. Is that help our listeners with what your thought process was at that age?
Well, it must have been closer to 9.5 years. Math is not my forte. I went to law school because they didn't have math on the LSAT, but it must have been 9.5 years. I should be better at the math by this point, telling this story. But so I started having night terrors, really bad ones. I was screaming at night when I was about 12 years old. And I was screaming at night, waking everyone up. I was sleepwalking. And my parents, and I still couldn't completely, all these years later, I've never completely figured out why they would do this, because there were so many secrets. And my father, in addition to being a pedophile, was also, he was an alcoholic. There was a lot of violence, screaming at my family life was very scary. And so they decided they would send me to a child psychiatrist. But I was told, I mean, I knew that I wasn't allowed to tell the truth. I can't, I had a little sister. She was luckily not molested, but had other traumatic things going on. So I was waking her every night with the screaming. And so I went to see this therapist, and I was seeing him for a while, and I knew not to tell my story. I read really young, and there's Jane Eyre. In Jane Eyre, there's Mrs. Rochester, the wife who's in the attic. I really thought if I told, my father would lock me in the attic, and I would spend my life, locked in an attic screaming. So I don't know why they sent me. It could have been because my mother was trying to protect me and stop it. Maybe it was her idea. And maybe it was my father's idea, because there's a little part of me that believes he was trying to, paper the file, as it were, so that if I ever told as I got older, he would, say, no, look, this is a hysterical little girl. We even sent her for help. I don't know. My mother would never talk about it, and I never asked my father. So they sent me to this doctor, and I was seeing him. And one thing about my story, and for your readers, your listeners, it's a little bit, I'm going to be very, very, very forward. So my father touched me and I touched him, but he never penetrated me with his penis. And when I was 12, he came home one day and my mother was out, and came home, and he was a little bit drunk, and he tried to kiss me in a way that he'd never done before. And I knew by this time about sex. I mean, I was, I understood enough about sex to be scared, and I didn't want him to go to that level of penetration. I thought, if he does that, I'm going to kill myself. And I pushed him away. Luckily, my mother and my sister came home at that moment, And I decided that I would try to tell the psychiatrist without telling him the whole story, just enough so that he would get suspicious and call my parents in, which did happen. Back then, it was a long time ago. Today, I would hope that this would be reported to authorities. I told him, but back then, we didn't have the reporting requirements. This was like I'm 67 to put context on it. So this was a long time ago. And he called them in, and my father came back and he told me that he said, "Oh, the doctor told me that you have something called an edible complex, that you're in love with me, and I need to stop spending time with you." Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But I know two things. My father never touched me again. He left me a copy. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with the book, Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. My father was a professor. He was an English professor, so books were a big part of my childhood. And he left me a copy of the Scarlet Letter on my bed. And I read it, and I took that to mean that my father was sending me a message. If I ever told that I would end up, in the book, the pastor pretty much gets away, and Hester ends up having to sew a letter on her chest, and is metaphorically branded for life. And I thought, if I ever tell, I'm going to be metaphorically branded for life. He'll lock me away like Jane Eyre, and I'll have a Scarlet Letter. So I kept my mouth shut after that.
So
That's the story.
yeah, I want to see if I am tracking correctly the chronology. You had held all of this in for nearly 23 years or so before you sought therapy. Am I following that correctly?
4.5 to 33. I finally went to therapy at the age of 33. I did see a psychiatrist when I was 22 after the Key Bridge incident. My mother actually helped me find one for medication. And I started to tell him, but I stopped myself from completely telling him the story because he seemed not to respond to it. So I finally sought real help, where I was completely honest and authentic about what happened when I was 33. And that was after the grope on the subway. And
Yeah, something very important, and I want to ask you a question that involves leaders in an organization. You remain silent about this for what we're now learning 29 years approximately, and you were functioning in the workplace, still withholding information. If I were a leader in a company and you were a part of my staff, but you were still holding this in, Andrea, I'm asking you to kind of describe your behavior. I mean, were you just kind of sheepishly looking down at your feet kind of thing, or were you overtly masking all of this? In other words, you're hiding this, but yet, is it possible that I, as a leader, might determine or assess that, nope, there's something more, Andrea?
I think you could. I mean, I was a good actress in that way. I had learned young, but I think there were telltale signs. When I look back, my posture was never great. I hunched. I often appeared to be extroverted, but I hunched. I was really hypersensitive. And I was also hyper vigilant. If anyone had any criticism, I would, really start to fall apart. And I was always apologizing, for even the slightest thing. I'd have a typo in something, and now, as lawyers, we don't want typos in things. But if I saw a typo, then I would at that point really fall apart. My reaction to mistakes was was exaggerated. I later, as an adult, much later, after I'd gotten help and lots of therapy, have had the opportunity to manage lots of people. And when I see that kind of hypervigilance, I worry about, is there something wrong at home? And I might sit down with people and ask them. I mean, today we have a lot of employee assistance programs, or we can at least be a little bit more open about lending an ear. Back then, it was difficult, and I was young. I don't know how much, I would have trusted people. It took me a long time to trust, but I think those are things you could do, is to be aware, to lend an open ear, as it were. And and I think for me, it was, that hypervigilance, that overreaction, that, I chewed on pens. I was always, I was nervous, always very, very nervous. So if I wasn't perfect, it wasn't good enough. So I think those were my signs. Um, I'm a really hard worker, so I could throw myself into work very easily.
What you're saying is very, very important. And I don't want our listeners to think that I am trying to create any kind of a fortune teller or anything like that. But what you said is very important. Maybe a telltale sign was you were extremely apologetic for, and I take that as maybe reflecting, oh, it's my fault. And that was part of your family training. And okay, so you take that into the workplace. Oh, it's my fault. And oh, I'm so sorry. And maybe over dramatizing a little bit. And I'm certainly not trying to marginalize what your past was, not at all. But we might just think that if we have someone in our organization who is that way, just as you said, and I'm a believer because I know it to be true, there's a continuum between home and work. If things aren't going well at home, you'll likely carry that into the workplace. And if the culture in the workplace is not right, you'll largely carry that into home. I'm a believer that there is that, because of that continuum between home and work, we need to be very vigilant about the culture we have in each location. And yes, employee assistance programs, but as you so eloquently stated, Andrea, you're not going to tap into any of that until and unless that trust factor is involved. Am I accurately characterizing your feelings then?
Thank you, Ron. I think that's a really good characterization of how I felt as a young lawyer, and who, just getting into a more corporate environment. My career before that I was a nurse, and it was a little bit easier there because you're working so hard. And it was, I mean, a different environment, a hospital environment, but in a more corporate environment, that's the perfect assessment.
Did you find it particularly difficult to trust men as opposed to women, or is gender irrelevant for trust?
I think it was a different kind of trust. My mother betrayed me on a really, really, really profound level. So I think sexually, I could not trust men. And I might have actually, and this is not to over, overused I was attractive as a young woman, and I might have used that as a way to manipulate men in my life. I did. But I think with women, when women would let me down, if I had female bosses, I strangely enough, I think I had an easier time working for men than with women, because I was so sensitive to that betrayal of my mother. I have written about this and really done some reflecting. And in some ways, my father, was a very disturbed human being. And what he did was criminal, absolutely criminal. He deserved to spend his life in jail. But my mother was not in that way. And she had her moments of really loving me. And I think in many ways, that betrayal took me longer to get over than the incest, because he was such a monster. You could just look at it and say, okay, this is just a terrible person. But my mom, it really hurt me on a deeper level. So in some ways I had a harder time with women. I know that sounds, but I didn't have a lot of female friends. I other than my beloved sister, who I have to mention because she was, I always say, my first true love. But it was hard.
And I appreciate your candor with this, because I can follow what you're saying, and I can appreciate the aspect of betrayal. Curious, is your dad still living?
No, my father, so I think my father dying was kind of it was the beginning of my ability to go forward, to start talking more publicly. Now, I had already had therapy for many years, but when he died in 2017, and I've always used writing as a creative outlet, and have always been in writing groups. I have a degree in creative writing, among others. And I began to write about what happened to me after his death. So both my parents are deceased now. My father died in 2017, and my mother died in 2023.
I want to take a very brief moment to tell you about myself, the Cooper Culture, a certified veteran-owned small business. I am a retired lieutenant colonel serving the Air Force for 22 years as an F-4 pilot, commander. I have 300 combat missions. I specialize in executive leadership training, team building, and workplace culture, where we help businesses to develop a culture of loyalty, trust, and by developing personality traits and personal strengths, we can help identify those traits that support the company's objectives. We do this through half-day and all-day training shops. I'm also a public speaker, where I welcome the opportunity to speak with your group to help you develop your team to the point where people are loyal and they know exactly how they fit in the organization and contribute to your strategic objectives. Through that, you will have a very profitable company and a psychologically safe space where people know they can freely discuss everything about the company themselves, and we are always working together to progress. Contact me at ron@thecooperculture.com. Our website is thecooperculture.com. Look forward to the opportunity to speak with your group, work with your group, to take your group to the next level, to where we soar together. Let's work together. Talk to us about resilience, and this may be a topic that we need to spend more time on, a lot more time, but you were 20 or so years into this trauma before you had the resilience to say something to the effect, no more, I will overcome, I will seek therapy, I need to categorize, that's my term, the past, such that it doesn't totally define you, but your past will inspire you, because you're not the only person who has had this happen to them. And I know there are others who are going through various phases of trauma. Talk to us about resilience, and maybe that turning point that you said, nope, no more of this. I'm making a decision to, and then fill in the blanks with that.
Well, actually, it's funny because I was always a bit resilient, obviously, to keep going, to keep surviving. It was more like a lifetime of doggy paddling, is what I say. I just doggy paddled away and kept going, and I truly am grateful for that. But I think what I didn't have is the resilience to really confront the past. And for me, when that grope happened and I had, started really having flashbacks, I decided at that moment there were other things in my life that I didn't want to live like this anymore. And I think that was, I didn't want to live with the secret, with the fear, and it took, I think I was afraid if I told it would kill me too. And look, telling this story was, my parents were still relatively young at that point. Telling this story, even back then, where people didn't face the criminal prosecutions they face today, you're betraying your network. But I think that resilience for me took time, and being able to know that I was so scared that when I told the story that I would completely break down and end up, in a hospital for the rest of my life, in paper slippers and a robe, shuffling around, not able to come, to move forward. But I say that I found that North Star buried inside of myself. I really believe that everybody has a North Star. And where that North Star lies, mine was covered up by a lot of scar tissue. So I had to excavate the past to find it. But we all have a shining star that guides us. It's there. And, I found it. And I think, why me and not someone else? I truly believe that if I can heal from this trauma and the type of trauma I went, because it was repeated over years, so can everyone else. So I think that I don't know if that answers your question, but I think everyone can find that little nut inside of themselves. But I do think you need support and friends and to rely on people. My favorite words were, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine, but I was so not fine. you know.
No, that's very, very well said. And
I wanted to ask you, your sister, this didn't happen to her. So, how has she supported you? Uh, and you said she had abuse, so maybe she would believe you, but how has she supported you?
So my father, as I mentioned, was really violent. I mean, we had meals what we couldn't get through, where tables would be, somebody would say the wrong thing or talk. We had to watch the evening news during when I was growing up. As you guys, many people who are my age, the Vietnam War was on TV, and so we watched the war every night during dinner. That's what we did, and we weren't allowed to talk. And if we spoke, the tables would get thrown, people would get hit. It was a terribly violent place. And my sister, we've tried to figure this out. He was more violent with her than he was with me. She always said he liked me better, and I said, "Oh, it wasn't a great like, It wasn't a good prize, but I think he might have." And so she has been incredibly supportive. When I first told her, it was a lot for her to take in, but she did. My sister's is was has is was a therapist at later in her life. She was a social worker who ended up working with abused children and then opened her own therapy practice. So she has been incredibly supportive. And when I started going really public in the last couple of years and even writing a book about this, she's been in, so supportive of everything. And she's read what I wrote because I wanted her, before I started on this path where I'm going to take a little sip of coffee. My throat was fogging. I'm not used to this. Before I started on this path where I have been so public about this, I wanted to make sure she was comfortable with it too, because it's her childhood. It's, part of this is her story too. Even if she wasn't molested by my father in that way, she was hit by him. And I'm talking about our parents, but she's been great. She's a few years younger than I am, but We are so lucky that we had each other. You know, children who survive very abusive families can, I think, go either way. They can break apart and not find each other, or they can find an ally. And my sister is my ally always, and I'm hers.
Andrea, a topic we need to delve into much further is how do you confront your past without reliving your past? But it's what I'm interpreting from your statement is it's a boundary that you've set that, yep, you acknowledge the past was what it was, but we're not going to live and relive the past. We're going to confront it that, nope, no longer, I am going to live a new life. That's what I'm interpreting. I want to ask you something that's somewhat personal, but would you consider another episode where we very specifically address how you confront the past without reliving and continuing to live in the past?
Oh, thanks, Ron. I would love to come back and talk with you and Marty again. So yes, and that is very specific, but I think we could do it.
Oh gosh, that would be great because our listeners need to know it seems to be a part of resilience. But yep, you confront the past but you block it off, so to speak. I mean, the memory is still there. There's still flashbacks maybe and so forth, but you have learned how to live a new life. Our listeners need to hear your story to learn how to do just that.
And I appreciate that. I'm telling my story because I'm hoping that somebody somewhere is suffering and needs to realize that it is possible. Recovery is possible. It's possible to thrive.
Yes. Andrea, we look forward to continuing our dialogue with you. What a great story you have in spite of your past, but you're living the great life now, and that's the important part. Thank you so much for sharing this part of your life. We look forward to continuing our dialogue.
Thank you, Ron. Oh, there's that froggy voice again. I'm gonna have to build up the vocal cords. Thank you, Ron, and thank you, Marty.
We appreciate having the opportunity to share our and our guests' life experiences with you.
The Cooper culture advances organizations to achieve and sustain high retention rates, connected communication, and trust through personality insights and principled leadership. You can contact us at our website, thecooperculture.com, and you can contact us directly at ron@thecooperculture.com or Marty, Marty, at thecooperculture.com. We work with you to help assess aspects of your culture to advance the environment and people to their best performance. We do that through our staff of certified personal performance coaches, leadership trainers, keynote speakers, and DISC personality behavior experts. You can book a speaking engagement directly through our website by contacting us at ron@thecooperculture.com. We look forward to sharing our life experiences with you, some of which are profound, some of which are pretty funny. Some of those life experiences are ones we'll never do that again because we've been through stuff. We truly look forward to working with you, speaking with you, helping advance you in any way that we can.